Hi guys, this is a continuation, the second part of the gastrointestinal system, the alimentary canal, as it were. We got up to the what the pancreas has to say about stuff that gets into the small intestine, which is the next part of the digestive system. Remember, it goes from the oral cavity into the oral pharynx, into the esophagus, esophagus into the stomach, stomach into the small intestine, the three parts of the small intestine. Then we'll get to these several parts, 6 parts of the large intestine, and then the anus, that's the end of the journey, peristalsis, the whole way. Right, so your food has the chyme, remember that chyme, that semi-fluid paste, my favorite stuff, that has made it into the duodenum. Remember, it's very acidic. As it says here, acidic chyme. Oh, gotta have my laser thing. Where's my laser thing? Yeah, here we go. Right. Right. So acidic chyme enters. Remember, the first thing's got to happen is that your small intestine, the duodenum, has to neutralize that acid. It's too acidic for the further enzymes to process this stuff. Remember, too, you still have, you still got well, there's 4 big constituents, and yeah, there are 4, right? Carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and nucleotides. And we got to break those down in 4 different ways. You started protein digestion because you hit the stomach. That's really what the stomach is for, is to really get protein digestion going. A little bit of carbohydrate digestion, but not a lot. A little bit of fat digestion, not a lot. All of that stuff is going to happen now once it hits the small intestine. And the small intestine, remember the the stomach is really all about, remember the 4 processes, right? There's mastication, there's digestion, then there is absorption. So the stomach is a big digester, but not a big absorber. It's the small intestine that really gets absorption going. And in fact, the absolute majority, the bulk of the nutrients that you ever get out of food is absorbed in the small intestine. All right, so stuff gets into the duodenum, right? The intestinal mucosa secretes secretin into the bloodstream. What does that do? That stimulates the pancreas. And the pancreas, remember, its exocrine function is going to be digestive juices, pancreatic juice, and which will include bicarb to neutralize the acid. Right? So secretin stimulates the pancreas to release pancreatic juice high in bicarbonate ions. Cholecystokinase, CCK, stimulates the pancreas to release pancreatic juice high in enzymes. All right, so both of these things go through the pancreatic duct. They enter into the duodenum through the ampulla of Vater, or the hepatopancreatic ampulla. And so there it is. Okay, so now we're neutralizing things. We're getting stuff in the duodenum. Remember, the duodenum too cannot handle the volume of stuff that the stomach can handle. The stomach can handle as much as 2 liters or maybe even more, but the duodenum cannot handle 2 liters all at the same time. So it gets a little bit and then it shuts off the duodenum. All right, so we move along. Now, the liver's got to have something to do with it. So the pancreas, and we had a whole list of enzymes and substances that the pancreatic juice contains and what their function is. Now, the liver also has a function here. The liver has a function in coagulation proteins. It has a function in producing albumin to regulate the osmolarity of your blood. Your liver is the do-it-all organ. It serves to process breakdown products from hemoglobin. And now it has to do with digestion too. All right, so you know where it is. It's on the right side, upper right quadrant of your body, below the diaphragm and behind the ribs. Most of it's behind the ribs. Lots of blood flow into the liver. Here it is. So I decided to throw a picture in there. Remember, we have the GI tract. The tract means the lumen, the things that form the tubes that take your food products from the oral cavity to the anus. Those are the tubes. That's called the gastrointestinal tract, or the alimentary canal. But then you have other stuff that are not in the canal, but they're outside of the canal. Those things are called accessory digestive organs. They include your teeth, your tongue, your salivary glands. These things are not in the tract. They're outside of the tract, but they do something for digestion, right? Then, of course, you have the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. They are not in the tract, but they provide things for digestion. Here's all the things on the right side of the screen that are included in the tract itself. All right, so we're moving along. Oopsie. What happened to my slideshow here? Come on. Ha! Got it. Okay, liver. This is what a liver looks like. Now this is an extracted liver from your body. We pulled it out. We have four lobes to the liver. The right lobe, which is on the right side of the body, and remember, you're looking at this liver. In fact, the liver on the left side is an anterior view. You're looking at it from the front. So what looks like the left side on the screen is the right side of the liver. The right lobe of the liver is huge, giant, big, enormous. The left lobe is relatively large compared to the other two. Then you have the caudate lobe and the quadrate lobe. So here's a posterior inferior view, really. Basically, what they're looking at is the underside. Mostly, you can think of this as looking at the underside of the liver in the same perspective as you had here. It's just like if you took this liver on the left side of the screen and tipped it backwards in a sense, so you're looking at its underside. Right, and so underneath it, you have the gallbladder, this kind of greenish pear-shaped structure. Remember, it holds bile. We're going to talk about what bile is. This is the inferior vena cava. So basically, your liver surrounds the inferior vena cava, but it doesn't have much interaction with the inferior vena cava until the liver has done what it wants to do to the blood coming to it mostly from the small intestine. And so that has all the digested components in it, the amino acids and monosaccharides and fats. Well, some fats actually. There's something else that happens to fats that bypasses the liver, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. So these things they go through the portal, what's called the portal circulation, the hepatic portal vein. This structure here, the hepatic portal vein, comes from mostly the small intestine. All the digested products that end up in the bloodstream, they go to your liver first. The interesting thing there is that what that means is that your liver takes a look at what you just ate. Whatever you ingested and digested and absorbed is now in your bloodstream. That blood supply goes right to your liver, and your liver takes a look at it first. So your liver is, in this sense, you can think of it as an organ of detoxification. This also becomes sort of the bane of pharmaceutical companies. The good example, or an easy example, is ibuprofen. Ibuprofen is quite ubiquitous. It's all over the place, and lots of people take ibuprofen for lots of different reasons. Ibuprofen, if you go to your doctor and you twisted your ankle or whatever, you might get what we refer to as an anti-inflammatory dose of ibuprofen. That is actually, that dosage that you're going to get is really twice as much as you actually need. And the reason you get twice as much, because when you're taking an oral pill, if you take 800 milligrams of ibuprofen, which is the typical anti-inflammatory dose, only about 400 milligrams of that is actually going to make it into your bloodstream. Why? This guy right here, this thing right here will take out approximately half. So it will detoxify half of that. So if you could just inject ibuprofen right into a vein, you'd only need 400 milligrams. But you're not going to do it that way. You're going to take it orally. It's going to be digested and absorbed. Half of it will be taken out by your liver. We can quibble about the specific percentage. But so your liver has something to say about whatever you eat, and you want it that way. You want your liver to look at the stuff that you have just ingested and absorbed. If there are poisons or toxins or things in there that it feels would not be very healthy for you, you want the liver to have a say, to take stuff out that could be detrimental to you. All right, so here it is. From the anterior view, you can see the gallbladder just kind of peeking out from underneath there. So remember these relationships, because we're going to get into these. You're going to see different views as we go along, so that you understand what it kind of essentially what you're looking at here. And remember, so from this angle, here's anterior view. That would mean that if I could take this liver out of the way, your stomach would be over here. The heart is right up on top of that. The right lung is over the top of the liver. The left lung is over here, mostly over the top of the stomach and spleen. All right. And then right underneath the liver, certainly, especially on the right side, you're going to have a kidney. A kidney is going to be down here, right underneath the liver. We're going to see that in a bit. All right. So now we take a small section, little tiny microscopic section of the liver. We chop it out. We bring it over here. It's composed of an organized bunch of what are called hepatic sinusoids. These are just sort of rivers that bring blood and drain the blood into a central repository. So it takes blood from hepatic portal vein. Remember, portal means it's coming from the intestines, especially the small intestine. And then that blood goes through the sinusoid, and these liver cells will go about the process of detoxifying this blood. Whatever they decide that should be taken out end up in these structures called bile canaliculi, and they are gathered up into larger ductwork, bile ducts or ductule, and then they join together into larger ducts, and that ends up going out of the liver into the gallbladder. The liver has to have its own blood supply, of course, like all other organs have their own blood supply. So the liver is operating on the blood that comes into it from the intestines, but it also has to have fresh oxygenated blood to do its work. Of course, and you have arteries that do that, hepatic arteries. That's great. Eventually, though, the hepatic arteries and the portal veins join their blood supply together, and then that whole gamish of blood, that whole mushed together pile of blood now ends up going into the hepatic vein, and the hepatic vein joins in with the inferior vena cava, and then of course that goes to the right atrium, and we've already been through that whole thing. You know that, all right? So that's the flow of blood. So the flow of blood is from the arteries and the hepatic portal vein through the liver, through the sinusoid, into the center of the sinusoid, which is a hepatic vein. And the flow of bile goes the other direction. It goes out from the canaliculi into the bile ductule, into bile ducts, into the gallbladder. Now we'll see that. Right, so here's a close-up of that. My dog wants to play. Sorry, puppy. Oops, now I'm in the way. You can't read anything, so I gotta move me. Hey, buddy. Oh, my dog wants to play. All right, so it's the same story here. It's another picture. Branch of hepatic portal vein. Here's a branch of hepatic artery. Right, they head off in the same direction. Eventually, they merge together. The remainder of that blood ends up in the central vein, or the hepatic vein, which ends up flowing into the inferior vena cava. Going the opposite direction is the bile canaliculi, and the bile that gathers goes into a bile duct out into the gallbladder. Come on, slideshow. What are you doing? There we go. Okay, now, I gotta move me again. Look at this. Okay, liver functions. Holy camole. It is unbelievable, the stuff that your liver does. It produces glycogen from glucose. You know that already. It also, it makes glycogen from glucose, but if you need glucose, it can turn glycogen into glucose, right? It oxidizes fatty acids, synthesizes lipoproteins, phospholipids, and cholesterol. Blah, blah, blah. synthesizes plasma protein, mainly albumin, but also fibrinogen. It's pretty busy, all right? Stores iron, you already know that. It stores iron as ferritin, because we went through that with hemoglobin metabolism. Phagocytizes damaged red blood cells. We've already been through that with the red blood cells lasting 120 days. Removes toxins. It's a detoxifying organ. Acts as a blood reservoir, and then role in digestion is to secrete bile. And now we're going to talk about what bile is. Well, we'll get into what bile is as we go along. Okay, so I'm way in the wrong place. I should probably just leave myself down here. All right, so here's the big functions. Hey, he really wants to play. Sorry. I'm sorry, buddy. All right, so here's all the things. And this was in the last screen. This is just a reiteration of what you saw on the last screen. Okay, bile. What is in bile? Well, we already know one thing that's in bile, breakdown products from red blood cells. We've been through that whole metabolism. Okay, so that's part of what's in bile. What else is in bile? Water. Water's everywhere. Bile salts. Now, bile salts are very special. They're called bile salts, and of course they are salts in the chemical sense. They're produced from cholesterol. Their big function in digestion is to emulsify fats. Emulsification of fats is extremely important. If you ever added oil and water, you add vegetable oil to water, right? You get two separate layers. You get a water layer, and an oil layer, right? And oil and water don't mix. But every baker knows that in order to get oil and water to mix, you have to add what's called an emulsifier. Well, so does your body. Your body has to do the same thing. It has to add an emulsifier. Bile salts serve that role as the emulsifier. What that does is that takes this oily, fatty layer stuff that you ate, right? You ate butter, or you ate, you had a salad and you had olive oil on it or whatever. Lots of your foods have some kind of oil or fat in them, a lipid. In order to digest it, you have to break it down to smaller and smaller components. Well, in the oil world, that's referred to as emulsification. And so if you emulsify it into smaller and smaller droplets, you can metabolize it. That's the purpose of an emulsifier, and that's the purpose of bile. Right, so there you go, act as a fat emulsifying agent, right? Then you already know this, bilirubin with biliverdin. Bilirubin, red, biliverdin is orange, or bilirubin is biliverdin is kind of greenish, yellow-greenish. Bilirubin is a kind of an orange reddish color from hemoglobin breakdown. You know that? Cholesterol and electrolytes. So that's what's in bile. So since we're talking about the digestive system, we're really going to focus on the property of bile that includes emulsification of fats, fat metabolism. Okay, so here's a gallbladder. Now I've told you that bile that's gathered up from your liver is transported into the gallbladder. Again, we have the same views here that we had last time. An anterior view where this right lobe looks like it's on the left side, but it's on the right side of your body. There's the inferior vena cava. Right lobe and left lobe, those are really only the lobes you can see from the front. The other two lobes, which are much smaller, but still not any less important, the caudate lobe and the quadrate lobe can only be really seen from underneath. Now, all of this bile ends up in the gallbladder. It travels to the gallbladder through a duct. The duct leading to the gallbladder is called the cystic duct. All of the bile from all of the lobes of the liver that combine together into one duct is called the common hepatic duct. And that leads to, this is the common hepatic duct in here. That sends all of its bile to the gallbladder. The gallbladder is stored there. It has to travel there through the cystic duct. Now, when the common bile duct, the hepatic duct and the cystic duct join together on their way to the duodenum, they form what's called the common bile duct. It's the common bile duct that enters into or empties into the duodenum through the hepatopancreatic ampulla. All right. So here's a regulation of bile. Hormone cholecystokinin causes the gallbladder to contract. Now, this is a muscle. It's a muscle bag. It's kind of like your urinary bladder. It's muscular on the outside. CCK causes it to squeeze. That causes bile to exit out the cystic duct into the common hepatic duct, and the common bile duct and the cystic duct join together, and they become the bile duct or the common bile duct. That common bile duct is the thing that enters into the duodenum. But just before it enters into the duodenum, that tube joins with the pancreatic duct and all of its stuff that we saw on another screen. All the stuff that's going to come out of the pancreas is going to go through the pancreatic duct into the duodenum. Right, so here we are in the duodenum again. And so, we've been through this. Here's where now the gallbladder will add into what the pancreas had. Remember that CCK and the other hormones that somatostatin that prompted the release of these enzymes and buffers into the duodenum. And now you add into that bile. All right, so let's see what happens to this stuff. So here's somatostatin, right? Inhibits the secretion of acid by parietal cells in the stomach. Okay, cholecystokinin decreases secretory activity of gastric glands, inhibits gastric motility, right? So it slows down how much stuff is coming into the duodenum, stimulates the pancreas to secrete fluid with high digestive enzymes. So now you're going to start to digest, really break down these products so that you can absorb them. It's really the point. And you have these other hormones that control the amount of stuff that gets into the duodenum, the pH of the stuff in the duodenum, the fat digesting ability in the small intestine, and so on. Right, so now bile salts. I mentioned emulsification. Breaking up of large fat globules into smaller globules, like a detergent, like a soap. You're used to Dawn detergent. Dawn, they like to advertise that you can clean up animals that have swum in where ships have released oil into the water, and of course we wish that wouldn't happen. But Dawn's there to save all the life that's been covered in oil. That's because it emulsifies. I won't get into that we'll just stop that whole discussion right there. But the point I wanted to bring up there was Dawn soap acts as an emulsifier to the oil, breaks it up into smaller droplets. Right, and when those smaller droplets, the point of having smaller droplets is to having a larger surface area for enzymes like lipase to actually act on these fatty acids to break them down into components that you can absorb, that you can absorb into the lining of the small intestine. There we go. So now this breaking down of these fats into smaller and smaller and smaller globules, droplets. These globules or droplets are called micelles. This word, it's a funny word, micelles. Those are smaller and smaller, tiny little droplets of oil, essentially, or lipid. These are the lipid or fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, K. The ADEC vitamins are the fat-soluble vitamins. All the rest of the vitamins, the B vitamins, vitamin C, other vitamins are water-soluble. So these are the fat-soluble vitamins. All right, we're in the small intestine now. Most of you have abdominal cavity. This thing, the small intestine, is many feet long. maybe as much as, on the order of probably 18 to 20 feet of tubing folded back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. The point there is surface area. Surface area is the critical component to digesting and absorbing nutrients. The more tube you have, the more surface area you have, the more stuff you can suck out of the things you eat. It's just that simple. Right, so it receives chyme, you already know this. It receives stuff from the liver, it receives stuff from the pancreas. We've been through that now. Completes the digestion of nutrients, absorbs, absorption. That is the critical function of the small intestine. And then stuff that it can't absorb, transports it to the large intestine. We'll talk about that in a moment. Right, so it's just that surface area. Surface area is the thing. Okay, so you've got many, many, many feet of small intestine, which is great. That's a nice start. And then, in addition to that, you have a folded surface. We're going to talk about that. That's called the circa plicularis. In a moment, you're going to see a picture of that. That's just another folded surface of the inside of the small intestine. The mucosal layer of the small intestine has ridges and valleys. And then, in addition to that, you have this stuff that are called microvilli. Now, you learned about microvilli a long time ago, but you've never really seen it. Microvilli is not cilia. Not cilia. Cilia is different than microvilli. Microvilli are simply a way to increase surface area even more. Many really magnify this many times. So you have an incredible amount of surface area in the small intestine. Microvilli accomplish that for you. That just allows you to absorb more of the digested material. But otherwise, the cells are set up pretty much the same. Columnar cells with microvilli. Lots and lots and lots and lots. The whole lining, most of the lining of the small intestine is microvilli. Now, these are the plica circularis that I mentioned. Right? These are just folds within the mucosal layer. And so the inside of the mucosa of the small intestine has folds, kind of like an accordion, we'll say. On those folds are villi, more folds. On the top of the villi is microvilli. So this is not microvilli, what you're looking at here. Right? These are villi, or any singular one of those would be a villus. On top of that, now I'm going to go back and I want to show you what I mean. Right? This folded area is the plica circularis. The folded area of the mucosa on top of the plica circularis is a villus or villi. And then we go back. On top of the villi are microvilli. So it's folds upon folds upon folds. This increases the surface area hundreds of thousands of times. I'm going to remind you again, here's your layering. You have mucosa. This is all mucosa. All of this stuff is part of the mucosa. Underneath that, the connective tissue layer, kind of holding it all together, called the submucosa. Below that is the muscularis. And when we're in the small intestine, we're into the circular and longitudinal layers of muscle. The circular is closer to the submucosa. The longitudinal muscle is the next layer out of muscle. And then holding it all together around the outside is this stuff called serosa. Really, really thick, dense connective tissue. Right, so here's another picture. This is just another depiction of what we're talking about. Here's the small intestine, okay? We cut open a view in it. You can see the circular folds, and the last slide was called plica circularis. Circular folds, that's what those are. That's just one way, increase surface area. Then we magnify this little section in here. Oh, now we get to villi, right? So each one of these little projections is a villus. And then we take one villus, we blow it up, and on top of that is the microvilli, which is also referred to as a brush border. So you'll see that term brush border. And a brush border is this microvillus structure that's on top of each individual cell inside the mucosal layer of the small intestine. All right, so this is just another view of it. Now, something that you should look at here is now we're going to look at the circulation inside these inside the mucosa, right? So in the submucosa is the circulation, the arteries and veins, but you also have lymphatics in there. Now, lymphatics are going to be extremely important in the next part of this discussion, the next part of the conversation. So you have arteries coming in, veins leaving. Remember, the whole point here is to absorb the nutrients that you have digested. So let's say you digest onto a monosaccharide. The monosaccharide is absorbed in a cell, and then it is transported into the blood vasculature. That vasculature now becomes the hepatic portal circulation, and it goes to the liver. So that's what happens to water-soluble nutrients, amino acids, monosaccharides, and nucleotides. Those are water-soluble. They go into blood circulation. Fats are transported into lymphatic circulation. Now, that bypasses the liver, right? This lymphatic circulation doesn't also go to the liver. Lymphatics form the lymphatic system, and of course they go through lymph nodes. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. All right. So secretions of the small intestine. We've talked about a lot of these things already, right? You have mucus secreting goblet cells. Mucus is present all the way through the alimentary canal. Remember I told you it's to reduce friction. There's a lot of stuff in here. There's a lot of squishing and mushing of the stuff that you eat in order to break it up, in order to digest it, in order to make smaller and smaller bits and pieces that you can absorb. All of that work requires a nice slippery surface for everything to flow. So mucus is present everywhere. Now, digestive enzymes. Huge numbers of digestive enzymes, right? So peptidases. Now, what we have to remember is how are amino acids put together? They're put together through peptide bonds. That's what they're called. One amino acid is connected to another amino acid through a peptide bond, and then another peptide bond and another peptide bond, blah, 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 on and on and on until you get yourself a polypeptide. You need an enzyme to break that down. They're called peptidases. They break peptides down into amino acids, and I will keep hammering this point. You've got to break it down to its minimal component, to the monomers of that particular item. So peptides and proteins have to be broken down to amino acids to be absorbed. All right, next up, now you've got polysaccharides, right? Large starches and large groups of sugars that are connected together. You have to break them down to monosaccharides. How are you going to do that? You need all these enzymes. Sucrase breaks down sucrose. Maltase breaks down maltose. Lactase breaks down lactose. So let's break these down into monosaccharides, which can be absorbed. And then finally lipase, fatty acid enzymes to break down fatty acids. Now they don't get broken down because there's really no monomeric unit for a fatty acid, but they get broken down as far as they can go. You're going to see that in a minute, how far down we can go. But basically fatty acids and glycerol. That's where you have to get down to get them to be absorbed. All right, so here you go. Here's the list of all the enzymes that are present and necessary for the digestion of food that you eat. Starts in your mouth, salivary. So what you're going to see is this thing is called salivary amylase. But look down here, you also have pancreatic amylase. Salivary amylase gets things going from the saliva. But then pancreatic amylase is going to continue that process. And then a lipase, that's an enzyme to break down lipids. Trypsin and chymotrypsin break down proteins. Carboxypeptidase breaks down peptides into amino acids. Nucleases. We didn't even talk about those, but of course you have nucleases. Break down nucleic acids into nucleotides, which is the monomer. And then further on down into the intestine, enterokinase, more peptidase, intestinal lipase, sucrase, maltase, and lactase. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot. All right. Now, you only need these things to be secreted when you have something around to be digested. Mucus secretion occurs in response to mechanical stimulation of the presence of irritants such as gastric juice. So, of course, that's going to create more mucus because that means there's stuff coming into the duodenum. You need more mucus, and that will be released at the time that there are things present or being released from the stomach into the duodenum. And so on. The distension of the intestinal wall activates nerve plexuses. Plexuses. That's a fun word to say. In the wall of the small intestine. Of course, when there's something in there that's going to distend the wall of the small intestine, when that happens, there are nerves in the wall that are going to send neuronal signals, which will result in the release of more enzymes, more mucus, and also stimulate more smooth muscle contraction. And there you go. Distension stimulates parasympathetic reflexes that trigger the release of intestinal enzymes and also more smooth muscle activity. All right, so now we're going to get into the specific things that get absorbed, right? So they give you a molecule, an example molecule, maltose. You have an enzyme called maltase. And now this is an enzymatic reaction that requires the addition of water. So this is a hydration reaction. Right? You add water across that bond. The enzyme breaks it apart. And now you have two separate molecules, two glucose units. They can be absorbed. That's what you need. There's a picture, kind of this is a summary of monosaccharide or saccharide digestion and absorption in the small intestine. So you have to imagine this is all of the small intestine, right? And so they've split this thing open. You have partially digested starch, so you have to imagine you just came from the stomach. It's partially digested, but it's not digested enough. On the brush border, you have lactose and sucrose. You start to break down. Eventually, you get down further and further, pancreatic amylase. You get further and further and further. Now you have monosaccharides that have been all digested, and the brush border will absorb those. Now, we refer to a lot of these, especially lactase, sucrase, and maltase. Those enzymes tend to be referred to as brush border enzymes. There they are. Brush border enzymes complete the breakdown of starch into individual glucose or other monomers, and then they can be absorbed. This is just a summary of that process. All right, next up, that is carbohydrate digestion and absorption. Now, proteins. Pepsin in the stomach starts the process, breaks it down into polypeptides. That's not good enough. You got to break it down further. Pancreatic proteases, break it down into smaller and smaller units, smaller peptides. So you only have a few amino acids strung together. Now you got to finish the job. Intestinal peptidases will break them down into specific amino acids. Those specific amino acids can be absorbed. And here's another picture of that process. Right, you got your old pancreas up here, small intestine, just like the last one, except this time we're focusing on, there's a polypeptide over here at step 1. Right, all of these other enzymes, trypsinogen, chymotrypsinogen, procarboxypeptidase, those are all the inactive forms of those enzymes. They become activated when they get it expressed into the small intestine. Break it down, break it down, break it down. Eventually you get down to the amino acids, which the brush border can absorb. The columnar cell along that lines the epithelium, or it is the lining epithelium. That cell can then absorb that amino acid and usually propels it into the blood capillary. Where does that go? You should start to think, okay, it's in the blood capillary. It's going to go into venules, veins, into the hepatic portal circulation, into the liver. All right. Next up, fats. Now, fats is a little different here. I hinted at that a little earlier. Fat digestion, right? So they're emulsified by bile salts. Remember, that's what the purpose of having bile salts. Fats are digested mainly by enzymes from the pancreas and the small intestine. They're digested into glycerol and fatty acids. So remember what a lipid is, or what a fatty acid, or a fat. When we refer to a fat, we're talking about a glycerol backbone. Glycerol is this 3-carbon molecule here, plus some length of fatty acid chain that is attached to each of these carbons. So these fatty acid chains can be of different lengths, of different kinds. Lipase breaks it up into a glycerol molecule over here, which is fat soluble, and the fatty acid chain, which of course is also fat soluble. And they have to be broken up into micelles, and they are absorbed into lymphatic capillaries. Now, lymphatic capillaries inside the small intestine are referred to as lacteals. That word lacteal, that is part of the lymphatic system that is found in the small intestine and absorbs these digested fats broken into these components. So this is how it works. Over here on the left side of the screen, this is the lumen of the small intestine. All right, so you got fatty acids. They're broken up into, well, the fats are broken up into glycerol and fatty acid side chains. Fatty acids are absorbed through the brush border. And some of those can be used right in that cell if necessary, or they can be packaged in a sense. Fatty acids can be packaged into a thing called a chylomicron. Right, so a chylomicron is a bundled up form of fatty acids. And those are transported into the lymph, directly into the lymph. Right, so this is called a lacteal. So I'm going to go back because I want to show you something. You got to go back. Oh, I don't know if I can get back far enough. Maybe I can. Might take me too long to get back there. Way back. Ay. Haha. Here we are. So remember, right, here's a villus. Here's the blood vessels going through there, and the arteries and veins, whatnot, capillaries, but also the lacteal. Yes, the lacteal is a blind-ended structure. Right? It starts right here. There's no loop of lacteal. It's right there. So you digest a fatty acid, you get a fatty acid absorbed through the cells here. The cell puts it into the lacteal at this point, which is the beginning of the lymphatic system inside the small intestine. There we are. There it is. That happens through a thing called a chylomicron. All right, now here's another summary picture of that process. Again, pancreas. There's your intestine, small intestine, broken up. Now, this time they throw in the gallbladder because it stores and concentrates bile, and that releases bile into the duodenum. That helps to emulsify fats, and here is a picture of a micelle. Right, so here are bile salts around the lipid droplet in the middle, and that forms a micelle. Now that's not even quite small enough yet, but it's smaller than the original lipid droplet. Right, so we're breaking it up into smaller and smaller and smaller groups. We get the micelles. They are digested and absorbed by the brush border across the cell, packaged into chylomicrons, which is even smaller yet, and then that is transported into the lacteal. That's how fats get into your body. They go directly into the lymphatic system. They're transported through the lymphatic system, through lymph nodes, and then they are dumped into your subclavian veins on the right and left side of the body. Right. So here's a summary. Monosaccharides, broken down, they are put into the blood and capillaries. Right? Amino acids are actively transported into the blood and capillaries. Fatty acids and glycerol, they go into the lymph in lacteals. Some fatty acids with short carbon chains, some of those go right into the blood and the capillaries. It's a mixed bag, but we're really most interested in that you understand that most of the fatty acids go into the lymph, into the lacteals. Electrolytes, they go into the blood and the capillaries, and water, of course, by osmosis is drawn into blood and the capillaries, as you would expect. Again, this is chemical digestion. What we've been talking about now in the past, few minutes is chemical digestion, chemically breaking down the stuff you eat into smaller and smaller and smaller units to try to absorb what you can. There's also mechanical digestion still going on. Peristalsis is still taking place. But now you get a new thing. Well, it's not so new, really. But you get this thing called segmentation. Because remember, you have circular muscles that are doing this around the small intestine. And you have longitudinal muscles that are doing this. So you get this squeezing and squishing. Squeezing and squishing. And this happens in small segments all along the way. And so peristalsis is a wave-like situation that moves from, from the oral cavity, really from the esophagus on through the rest of the alimentary canal in a wave-like fashion. But in shorter bits and pieces, you get what's called segmentation, where a small part of the intestine will squish and squeeze and squish and squeeze and squish and squeeze, and that's called segmentation. That's just to mix stuff up more, to get more surface area, to break things down further, so that you have more things, you have a better opportunity to absorb the nutrients. Now, this happens small intestine, you're going along. Remember the three parts of the small intestine, right? You have the duodenum is first. That is less than a foot long. Then you have I was going to point out here the ileocecal sphincter. That is the last section. That's just before you get into the large intestine. And then you have in between the duodenum at one end and the ileum at the other end. You have the jejunum in between. The length of the jejunum and the length of the ileum are approximately the same, roughly speaking. Much, much longer than the duodenum. All right, now we made it to the large intestine. Here we are. Okay, so you have pretty much absorbed all of the nutrients that you're going to absorb. By the time things get to the large intestine, nutrition-wise, there really isn't anything that you're going to, maybe there's a little bit, as it says here, some electrolytes. You're going to reabsorb some electrolytes in the large intestine. The large intestine is also called the colon. So it starts at the ileocecal valve, and the first part of the large intestine is called the cecum. So the ileocecal valve is between the cecum and the ileum. Things go in there. Most of what you're going to do at this point is reabsorb water. The large intestine is your water reclamation facility. It reclaims most of the water because a very watery fluid goes in there. But of course, well, the hope is by the time it gets to the anus, it's not so watery. It's more of a solid fecal mass, as we refer to it. So just remind you of the anatomy. Here it is. Here are the parts. Here's the cecum. The first part of the small intestine is called the cecum. Now, this again is you're looking at a body. This is an anterior view. So this part of the small intestine, this over here is the right side of the body. It means over here is the left side of the body. So right side of the body has the cecum. Attached to the cecum is called the vermiform appendix, or what you just usually call the appendix. Right? That's why when people have appendicitis, they usually have pain in the right lower quadrant of their body. It's pretty classic for appendix pain, appendicitis. And that's why they dive in there to do an appendectomy if necessary. So the cecum is first, then you have the rising part here, right? This is called the ascending colon. So the parts, let's just do the parts of the colon. The parts of the colon are the cecum, the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, this part that comes back into toward the body, toward the middle of the body. And then you have the rectum, storage for feces, and then the anus with its anal canal. So cecum, ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid, rectum, anus. That's the path. These segmented units here, it looks like there's a constriction around this part that defines from one of those constrictions to the next constriction is defined as a haustra, or singular, haustrum. That's a haustrum. So all of these are all referred to as haustra. And then you have two places where there's a fairly sharp turn of the colon. The first one's called the right colic flexure. This is sometimes referred to as the hepatic flexure because you're right around the liver at this point. And over here on the other side is the left colic flexure, or this is sometimes referred to as the splenic flexure because the spleen is over in this area. So that's the review the anatomy there, right? Little or no digestive function, secretes a lot of mucus, as all parts of the intestine do. It's the only significant secretion of the large intestine is mucus. Again, reduces friction, keeps things moving along without any friction or places to catch things, which is quite painful. Absorbed water. 90% of the water that enters the colon is reabsorbed. So you're creating a more and more solid mass as you go along. There's also intestinal flora. You need bacteria in here. You need good bacteria, right? But there are bacteria in there that help to absorb certain nutrients, especially vitamins, breaking down cellulose. And then at the end you get feces, and the principle of evacuating feces from the large intestine is called defecation. It has lots of other names in common terminology. We seem to be coming up with more and more names for this process all the time, but it is officially referred to as defecation. Or you can say bowel movements. Now, things slow down when they get to the large intestine, right? It takes about 24 hours or thereabouts for things to go from the oral cavity to the anus, roughly speaking. But the process really slows down. So peristalsis really slows down when you hit the large intestine. It happens the movements are much larger, much slower. You do get mixing movements. So that means you get haustra, the constricted area of the haustra will squeeze, and there's still longitudinal muscle that helps to squeeze. Essentially, I always think of it as wringing out a sponge, right? You got the sponge full of water. You're squeezing it very, very, very slowly. That water gets reabsorbed by the cells. That's kind of how I think of it. Now, once in a while, hopefully, approximately once a day, or maybe more often or less often with some people, but you will get what are called mass movements. Now you have to think of a mass movement as when you follow a meal. When you put stuff into the digestive system, something else has to move out of the digestive system. And so I'll use my dog as a good example. He eats his food, and within 5 to 10 minutes of eating, he has to go outside and defecate. And you think, why is that? Well, he put something in one end, something else has to come out the other end. Now, of course, you are absorbing nutrients, so you are taking some things out. So all of the mass that you eat, not all of that ends up coming out in defecation, hopefully, right? The point is to absorb things. But that's a very strong response, referred to as a mass movement. And the defecation reflex relaxes the internal sphincter and then the external anal sphincter. Now you have some voluntary control of the external anal sphincter. You can squeeze, you can pucker up right now as you're sitting here. Not that you ever wanted to hear that from one of your professors, but there you have it. But there's an internal sphincter as well that you don't have volitional control of. Right. So now you've gotten to the end of the road. Feces, things that aren't digested or they're not absorbed. There are some things that you do digest that you just didn't have enough. If you had another 3 feet of small intestine, maybe you could have absorbed more stuff. You didn't have it, so it ends up in the colon. The colon doesn't have the ability, not much of an ability, maybe I should say it that way, not much of an ability to absorb digested food. All right, so what happens? Well, there is a little bit of water in feces. Most of feces really is water, despite its appearance. There's electrolytes, mucus, bacteria, and bile pigments. Pungent odor, you have many compounds that add into the pungent aroma of feces. There we have it. So, we've come to the end of the gastrointestinal tract, or the alimentary canal. You now know the whole point is to masticate, chew it all up, mush it, swallow it. Then you have to digest it. Digestion is not absorption. I want to reiterate that. Digestion is simply breaking things down into smaller and smaller components so that you can get to the level of the nutrients that you can use, that you can absorb, and that has to be the monomeric forms of proteins have to be broken down to amino acids, polysaccharides, starches have to be broken down to monosaccharides, nucleotides have to be broken down to nucleosides and individual bits, and then, nucleic acids have to be broken down to nucleotides and nucleosides too. There's a chemical difference there, but I won't get into that. And then fats have to be broken down as far as they can be, which is to take away the glycerol backbone and the fatty acid side chains, and you have to get them down to that form. The first three end up, not four, first three end up in the being absorbed in the small intestine and then put directly into the bloodstream, which becomes portal circulation, which goes to the liver first. So your liver can have a chance to take a look, detoxify whatever is necessary. Most fatty acids are also absorbed in the small intestine, but they are converted into what's called a chylomicron, and that is transported into the lymphatic system, predominantly the lymphatic system. And that takes a different route to get into the body, but it's got to go through lymph nodes. And then whatever you don't absorb ends up in the large intestine, or also called the colon. It's very, very watery when it enters. It's much more solid by the time it's what we call it feces. You have reclaimed a lot of the water. You want that water. In fact, your colon is a big storehouse of water. In fact, I gave blood not long ago. I told you about that. I lost a pint, about 500 mils of a lot of water. Plus, obviously, red and white blood cells, of course, which is really the point. But that water that I lost is made up within hours from, I don't have to drink water. They always give you water to drink, right? I don't have to drink water. I have a storehouse of water in my colon. My colon simply reclaims more water to make up the blood volume that was lost. The red blood cells take longer. But so your colon is a storehouse of water. There's peristalsis that happens the whole way along. Peristalsis is a one-way journey, but you also get mixing, and that is sort of a back and forth journey, but only in smaller segments of the small intestine and the large intestine. Hopefully things will stay. Peristalsis should move in one direction always. As we know, it doesn't always. If there are blockages in the small or large intestine, or twists, sometimes the intestines can become twisted. That will stop the flow of going in one way. And yes, one of the ways that we know this is that people tend to vomit up components that we would normally find in the small intestine or the stomach. And we say, yeah, this isn't right. This isn't what we should be seeing. So we sometimes suspect blockages because of that. That's it for the gastrointestinal tract. Take a listen to this, and we'll talk a little bit more this week about the gastrointestinal tract, but we're really going to get into the respiratory system, of course, this week. Thanks for your attention. I'm going to close down the shop here and send it off onto YouTube.